Sweden's international image is of a sensible, liberal and safe nation. So how exactly did it become the gun crime capital of Europe? Welcome to the program. I'm Philip Hampshire. Gun crime in Sweden has seen a multi-year spike, which has proven fertile political ground for right-wing parties such as Sweden Democrats. That's because the increase in violence has mirrored the increase in migrants arriving. But is that really the cause of the problem?
So far this year, the Swedish police have registered 236 shootings and 29 killings. The statistics were similar in 2022. Gun crime in Sweden is increasing at a faster rate than anywhere else in Europe. To put it into context, the European average for gun deaths is 1.6 people per million. In Sweden last year, it was 4 people per million, well over double. The majority of violence is linked to gangs largely made up of boys and men from poor areas with an immigrant background. Sweden has taken in the highest number of asylum seekers per capita in the EU since the migrant crisis of 2015. Is that community being used as a scapegoat, or is there a genuine correlation?
So let's meet our guests. Joining us from Gothenburg, we have Zeth Isaacson, who's from Stockholm University. Meanwhile, in Malmö, we have Ardavan Khusnud, who's an associate professor at Lund University. And joining us from Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, we have Jim Stenman, who's a Swedish journalist and political commentator. Well, if I can start off, Zeth, with you, I think the key question that we need to start off with from an international perspective is, what is the gun crime situation like in Sweden, in your opinion? Is it overblown in the international press, or is it underplayed? How do you feel about it?
I wouldn't say that it's overblown, well, I think it's highly dependent on who you ask when it comes to the political spectrum. The political right is constantly arguing that the issue is the most prominent, while the left is more want to highlight other issues. But yes, it is a crucial, important issue, and are in central of the Swedish debate as well. So it wouldn't surprise me that the international media is also attentive to the issue.
So, Zeth, in your opinion, is there sort of a cognitive dissonance, if you like, a sort of disagreement in Sweden as to whether or not this is actually going on, and if it is going on, the severity of it?
I think that everyone agrees that it is a very severe situation, but I think that it's more of a how severe it is question. No, it is a serious issue, and everyone agrees on that.
Ardavan, you're in a different part of the same country. What's your opinion on the situation with regards to the crime statistics in Sweden?
Of course, the situation is quite serious with respect to the firearm-related violence we're witnessing in Sweden. We have one of the highest rates of death shootings in Europe. Last year we had 64 individuals being killed in Sweden, making it up to 54% of everyone being killed in Sweden had been killed by a firearm. So the situation is quite severe and quite serious.
Jim, what's your perspective on the current crime situation in Sweden?
I mean, I agree with the other speakers that it is a very serious situation. And I think part of the reason why it's receiving so much attention is because it's quite the contrast if you look at sort of the view of Sweden in terms of a socialist utopia. And I'm not saying that Sweden is not a great place to live in when it comes to, universal healthcare and free education and things like that. But clearly the narrative has moved on. So people are shocked to learn the state of Sweden and gun crime and gang violence in particular. It's very surprising to people around the world, I'd say.
Zeth, now, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was actually talking to someone from the Social Democrats, which is one of your left-leaning parties and politically one of the more successful parties in Sweden that's tended to hold power over the last 100 years more than other political parties. And they tried to convince me, again, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, the gun crime was in fact some kind of a right-wing conspiracy theory being thrown around by newspapers like the Daily Mail and news websites online, and that really we should just pack it in and move on from it. Clearly, the conversation has moved on from that moment. What is it that has forced the conversation to move on? Is it the fact that they lost power in 2022?
They changed position before the election, so I wouldn't say that that is the main reason. But parties always try to adapt and try to get as many votes as possible. And when you see that the radical right-wing party, the Sweden Democrats, soared in the polls, there are good reasons for parties to adapt to their positions. But we should also acknowledge the fact that gun violence haven't been limited. They are still a severe issue in Sweden, and parties should always address those issues. So I think that the Social Democrats have changed the position for 2 reasons, both the issues and other parties.
Okay, Ardavan, if we pull up a photo that we have of, or a graphic that we have of where the violence takes place in Sweden, obviously there's a cluster of it around Gothenburg, which is where you are. There's a cluster of it around Malmo, which is where the bridge is that heads across into Denmark. These are both very dense urban areas. There's another cluster up in Stockholm as well. It's relatively obvious that if there's going to be a gun violence problem and it's gang-related or related to youths, it's going to be in inner cities. But then there are all these sporadic dots throughout the country. Are they happening in small towns, or is there a rural violence problem as well? Specifically, what do you think is happening right now in Sweden? It's not a general breakdown into a civil war, for instance.
During the last 15 years, we have experienced a significant increase in the firearm-related violence. And just like you said, they have been foremost concentrated around the 3 largest cities of Sweden, Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. However, with that said, what we are witnessing the last years is that more and more shootings are being conducted in smaller cities, and the locations moving from the larger cities. So that's becoming more and more common. I would not say that Sweden in any way is on the verge of a civil war or anything like that. Absolutely not, because the shootings are concentrated to criminal gangs and criminal networks, open drug markets. So in that case, it's not. It's absolutely not that worse.
Jim, what's your perspective on it? Is this a sort of criminal underclass problem? Is this an ethnicity problem? Is this a refugees problem? Where do you characterize the issues here personally?
I think it's a little bit of everything. It's a combination of a lot of different factors. I mean, obviously, having grown up in Sweden myself in the late 80s and early 90s into the 2000s, it's clear to me that Sweden has always had a huge challenge in terms of integrating immigrant populations into mainstream society, be it populations from the Middle East, Africa, other parts of the world. I think that's always been an issue in the country. Obviously, now we're at a stage where my understanding is that at least 1 in every 10 Swedes is foreign born. So the amount of immigration that we've seen following, for example, the Syrian war, the early days of the war, Sweden had pretty much open borders alongside Germany. I think that's put a lot of additional pressure on public resources in a country that was already struggling with immigration, integration. But I just want to be clear that I don't see this as a pure, ethnic issue. There's a lot of ethnic Swedes themselves who are involved with this kind of gang violence. But it's communities that have been left behind, people that are living in tough areas that they. How do I best express this? They're not very optimistic about their future, and that's why they're turning to gang crime, I'd say.
Zeth, I'm assuming you're in agreement with that.
Well, looking on the statistics on where these shootings takes place, the population in these areas have 40% of foreign-born or have parents that are foreign-born. I mean, like that shows something. But at the same time, there are also 28% of the population is also considered poor, which is 8% higher than in other areas. So it is a socio-economic issue, definitely, but but it is concentrated to these areas.
So, Ardavan, for you, is this an integration problem? Is this the fact that the government isn't doing enough to help out groups that have come into the country? Really, it must be very, very difficult if you are a refugee from Syria or from Somalia or from Sudan and you come across to Sweden, and this is one of the hardest languages in the world to have to learn off the bat, with very little connection to languages you might yourself be used to. Is this purely a language problem, or are there other factors here?
This is definitely a multifactorial problem we are having. One cannot really point out one single factor being the main reason for why the situation today is as it is. We have had many reports, both from different European countries, from the US, as well as from the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention in Sweden, showing that individuals with immigrant background are overrepresented in the criminal statistics. We don't really know why that is. We have had no research with respect to that. There are many theories and speculations on that. But there's no doubt that the integration have not been successful over the years. This is a bitter fact, and the responsibility is on Swedish politicians, which, however, is waking up today.
If we were to go back to 1982, Ardavan, from 1982 through until today, we're looking at 41 years. In that 41-year time spread, the Social Democrats have been in power in Sweden for every year except for about 12. So we're looking for about 2/3, maybe as much as 3/4 of the time. Is it reasonable to lay the blame entirely with entirely with the Social Democrats, or is it the other parties that are to blame during the periods they were in power, or has everyone dropped the ball here?
Well, to use your phrase, I think that everyone has dropped the ball here. And I think it would be wrong to say that it's only the Social Democrats, because even if the Social Democrats have been in power and been in government, the opposition have also had a crucial role and a pivotal role in this. So it's definitely not one single party to be blamed for this. But one can say that the Swedish system has not been so much open for changes and the reforms, and that our politicians and those having important roles as decision makers and policy makers, they have met a failure.
Okay, I've got a quote here from Victoria Tiblom, who is the group leader for Sweden Democrats. This is the right-wing party in Sweden that for many years was sort of excluded through a cordon sanitaire from participating in government, but is currently in a confidence and supply arrangement with the government. And she said this:
we have lifted a lot of problem areas. I mean, you can only solve the problems in a no-go zone if you talk about them. And we feel like a lot of the other parties, they have just neglected the problems. Same thing with immigration. If we talk about the problems that immigration brings, and also that the failed integration, then we can also start to find the tools to solve those problems.
Zeth, as we're looking at that, clearly she's laying the blame on immigration, which is something you might anticipate from a right-wing European party in the current political environment. Anyone looking at that, though, what's the alternative narrative? What else do you say about it?
Well, we also need to consider that parties are saying those things to also appeal to their own supporters. Parties are, after all, mostly invested in winning elections. And although, I agree that there are problems with integration, we can't definitely say that it is an immigration issue. I think that was mentioned previous as well. correlation doesn't imply causation, and we have to be very firm about that.
Okay, Jim, let me bring this across to you. We're getting into the difficult territory now. How do you fix the problem? What do we need to do? We're in this mess. How do we get out of it? What do you think?
Well, I think what was interesting with that quote, I mean, it definitely called for a solution. And I think we're at a point where we realize that the policies that Sweden has had as a country in the past, they're not really relevant in the 21st century, dare I say, anymore. So I think it comes down to politicians being honest with the people and being able to not just have difficult conversation, but come up with solutions. And I think part of that also needs to be looking at crime and punishment as well. I mean, you take a calculated risk in some ways when you decide to join a gang or when you commit any kind of crime in Sweden. And because, how do I say this? I personally know several individuals who found themselves in this situation, and perhaps they've spent a year behind bars for serious crimes, and then they managed to make it out. So I think if you have tougher punishments for those individuals, then surely the scenario is going to be different, because you don't want to spend 5-7 years behind bars. And I think it's a beautiful thing that Sweden is a progressive country where, you're not just locked up, as it were. You're actually, there's sort of a rehabilitation process that prepares you to re-enter society. And I'm sure therapy and all sorts of treatments are part of that. So it's a progressive approach to tackling crime, but I think we probably need to get tougher as a nation to prevent people from thinking that this is even an option.
Zeth, could this be part of the problem in Sweden, in your opinion? It is famous around the world for its, I wouldn't say lax prison system, because that's not entirely fair, but you have two angles to putting people in prison, one of which is rehabilitation, the other is separation from the rest of society, and there is an inherent conflict in a way between the two. Is Sweden too much on the reformation side of things, in your opinion? What's the general feeling in Sweden?
Well, if you look on what the party says, like most parties agree that we should have harder punishments. So that's not really the topic now. We can discuss if we have had to been too soft on crime, but at the moment, all parties calls for more polices and harsher punishments. We also have several reforms during the last government as well. But we can't look around the fact that at the same period we also had cuts in schoolings in many of these areas. And I mean, I think that some parties also advocate for implementing more of the social reforms as well. So I think that we have, as it is a multifaceted problem, we should have several different approaches to solve the issue.
Ardavan, where are the guns coming from in order to commit this kind of violence? And indeed, it's not even guns. I don't want to get into the more sensationalist aspects of it, but Sweden is a meticulous keeper of records. And if you want to go into the records, you'll even get details on how many hand grenade crimes have been committed, which would be unheard of in many countries in Europe, even those where there is a gun crime problem. So clearly, these weapons have to be coming from somewhere. And Sweden was never an especially militarized society.
Most of the weapons used in gang crimes are illegal firearms, and maybe not even most of them, every single one of them. And they are coming into Sweden from the Western Balkans foremost, a little bit from Romania, a little bit from the Czech Republic, but mostly from the Western Balkans. But we have also recently seen examples of weapons, of so-called 3D weapons printed out with 3D printers that are being used, but is mostly smuggled into Sweden via the Copenhagen-Malmö bridge from Western Balkans.
Now, I asked Jim already, where does he think the country needs to go? How do we begin to get out of the hole that Sweden is in? So I'm going to place that very difficult question with you now. What do you think needs to be done from here to get out of this hole?
The absolute most important thing to do today is to stop the recruitment to these criminal gangs and these criminal networks. The Swedish chief of police, Anders Thornberg, said for a year ago, if I'm not mistaken, that for every single person that's being killed in Sweden, you have 3 or 4 other young individuals standing in the queue to take over. So we need to stop the recruitment to gangs. And most of those individuals today being recruited to gangs are children. So we need to have close cooperation between schools, the police, the social security services, the children's psychiatric facilitations, and so on. That's the absolute most important thing, in my view, that we need to do in order to curb the current deadly situation. We are not to forget that until today in 2023, we have had 33 individuals being shot and killed. So even if it's not as much as it was last year this time, we are still having a lot of individuals perishing.
Right, let me take this over to Zeth. Zeth, you got off lightly here because I've asked the others how we'd get out of the position we're in, but I haven't asked you yet. What is your opinion?
I think that I agree with the previous speakers. It's highly relevant to stop the recruitment, and harsher punishment are on the political agenda. I think that most parties agree on that, and I agree on that as well.
Okay, but hang on a second, because if we go back and we look historically at large waves of immigration into many countries, not all waves of immigration, and by no means all countries, but in many cases, large waves of immigration into countries. We take the United States, large movement of Italians into the United States. The indigenous population sort of feels a little bit tribalistically towards them, excludes them from certain positions. The Italian mafia maybe springs up from that. When Jewish immigrants went into the United States, Murder Inc. sprung up out of that. When Armenians came into the United States, the Armenian mobsters began to pick up from that, because small groups that can't find work elsewhere tend to form a tribal, close-knit group themselves. Is that not part of the problem, and you need to break up the nature of these connections between groups and find them jobs? People with jobs have mortgages, they have houses, they get wives, they have children, suddenly haven't got time to go out and cause violence.
Yeah, there's a lot of plans to also... There's a lot of ideas, at least, to stop the recruitment, and by doing that, it usually means to increase access to social services, education, job opportunities, and so on. So that is definitely on the agenda.
Let me take that over to you. Jim, you were shaking your head there as I was talking about immigration.
Yeah, I mean, I have to be honest with you. I don't agree with that comparison. You can't compare Sweden to the United States. It's a nation of immigrants in the US. Sweden is a very homogenous society, and I think we need to remember that. We didn't necessarily have immigration prior to the 70s. My mother would have arrived from Ethiopia in the late 70s, early 80s. It was a very, very different society. And if you compare, say, Scandinavia to, the UK, where you are, or even France, I mean, these countries were essentially empires, right? You had colonies in Africa, Middle East, many different parts of the world. So I don't think that Sweden has been connected to the rest of the world in the same way that some other European countries have, which makes it more difficult to integrate into society if you don't have that culture of having a multicultural society. Obviously, that's shifted in the last couple of decades, but I think it's important to remember that it's a very homogenous society that's changed incredibly rapidly, and I think that partly explains why it is so difficult to integrate into, I'd say, Scandinavian society in general, not just Sweden.
Adovan, you're on board with that as well?
I think it's important to also understand that that in Norway, one of Sweden's neighbors, in Denmark, another neighbor of Sweden, in Finland, also a neighbor of Sweden, we do have a high rate of immigration and immigrants, but none of those countries have the same problem as Sweden have with respect to firearm-related violence, with respect to gang criminality and criminal networks. So there must be other factors interplaying and interchanging here. And what is very important for us as researchers, but also for the society to find out, is what is so special with Sweden? What have we done wrong here so that we find ourselves in this situation? And that's really the $1 million question.
Zeth, Ardavan, Jim, absolutely fantastic to have you on the show. Thank you for agreeing to talk about this very contentious and difficult subject. It's been a pleasure having you on. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate if you head on over to our YouTube channel. Just pop over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.